Hello, my friends. Before we get to the last 24 hours, I want to recap what Vladimir Putin said when he addressed the Russian Security Council 2 days ago. This matters because a lot of Western commentary is either ignoring it, misrepresenting it, or deliberately stripping it of meaning. Putin said he'd seen the plan, but it hasn't been formally discussed with him yet. He called the plan raw, unfinished, incomplete, not a final settlement. He said detailed talks are needed and that the provisions require complex negotiation. 2 days ago, I walked through the publicly leaked parts of the so-called 28-point plan, the version supposedly published by Alexei Goncharenko, and I pointed out several clauses Russia will never accept. The headline one is that Ukraine would be allowed an army of 600,000 troops. There is zero chance Moscow signs off on a Ukraine that large and armed. The point of Russia's operation from the start has included preventing a NATO-built, NATO-trained, NATO-equipped Ukrainian war machine sitting on Russia's border. So that clause is dead on arrival unless it's removed or massively revised. Same issue with the frozen assets provisions. Any plan that legitimizes seizure or use of Russian state assets by the West is unacceptable. And the clause limiting peacekeeping or monitoring forces in Ukraine to NATO country troops, that also won't fly. Russia will insist on airtight language preventing any Western military deployment in Ukraine under any disguise. On that note, I want to flag something already bubbling in Washington. The Washington Post ran a piece today claiming that if Ukraine is barred from hosting Western troops, the U.S. might compensate by deploying Tomahawk missiles there. That is insane and totally unacceptable to Russia. It directly contradicts even the recent American rhetoric about recognizing Russia's concern over long-range strike systems that could reach Moscow or Petersburg. If that's the kind of compensation some people in Washington are floating, it's sabotage of the entire process. Now, despite all these flaws, Putin said the document is something Russia can negotiate on. But here's what Western media is missing, and it's not a small thing. Putin made clear that Russia's preferred path is military. If Moscow had its ideal outcome, it would have no negotiations at all. No pressure to negotiate. Just Russian forces driving forward until the political objective is achieved, and that objective is no longer ambiguous. Putin has described the government in Kyiv as a criminal group. That points straight at regime change as the Russian end state. Negotiations don't guarantee that. Military victory does. So why negotiate at all? Putin explained, not in melodramatic terms, but clearly that Russia's friends and partners want a negotiated settlement if possible. China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and others. Putin emphasized that when he briefed them on what had been proposed and discussed with Trump in Anchorage, a modified Istanbul Plus framework. Russia's allies supported it. They want a settlement that ends the war responsibly, and they want Russia to be seen as acting in good faith. That matters because Russia is building a multipolar order with these states. If talks fail, Moscow's priority isn't just battlefield success, it's ensuring that its allies do not blame Russia for the failure. That is strategic discipline. It's also a major tell about how confident Moscow is. When you're winning and still willing to negotiate for alliance cohesion, you're signaling strength. Putin also said something else that Western commentary is skipping. If negotiations collapse because Ukraine or Europe rejects the framework, Russia is fine with that. Because Russia expects military victory anyway, and in the Russian view that victory is now on the horizon. In fact, Putin hinted that once talks collapse, Russia may be better off than playing this endless negotiation game, meaning if the West kills the deal, Russia will simply finish the job militarily. Read correctly. Putin's message is blunt. Negotiate if possible, but prepare for victory regardless, and do not fear talks collapsing. That's strength talking. All right, now to the last 24 hours, because we're already watching a widening rift between the U.S. and Europe, and it's getting uglier by the hour. Dan Driscoll seems effectively to have replaced Kellogg as the operational peace envoy, even if Kellogg is formally still in post. Kellogg keeps giving interviews. He just said the U.S. needs to avoid a new Budapest memorandum or Minsk-style trap, and he framed it as if Minsk failed because of Russia. Russian media immediately pointed out that Minsk II failed because Kyiv never implemented it, which is factually correct. Kellogg's comments make it clear he dislikes this Witkoff-style framework and wants to water it down or kill it. We're also getting media noise about who drafted the plan, who was excluded, and who was stunned. Bloomberg claims Rubio was cut out. Other reports say Rubio was deeply involved earlier. My read? Rubio is running his standard two-track game, publicly loyal to Trump and the America First realism pivot, privately reassuring neocon networks that he wasn't part of this horror. I can't prove that, but I've been watching bureaucratic warfare for decades. That's how these people survive. Here's what is clear. Parts of the plan were altered after the first draft. We now hear the 600K Ukrainian army clause was inserted by Rustem Umerov, the head of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. That tells you Ukraine has been rewriting the draft in places, despite denials. A Moscow acquaintance emailed me yesterday with a sharp observation. The reason the leaked 28-point plan looks vague, contradictory, and amateur is because it's the Ukrainian edited version. It probably includes Kyiv's insertions that Moscow hasn't agreed to, and maybe even ones Washington hasn't fully agreed to either. Neither Washington nor Moscow has officially published a final text, so it's entirely possible Russia has a different, earlier version than what the media is circulating. The leak never should have happened. It was meant to be private. Witkoff publicly complained and hinted the leaker was K. That points to Kellogg. There's another theory floating that K refers to Kirill Dmitriev. I find that extremely unlikely. Kellogg benefits most from sabotaging this. So the plan is still fluid, unclear, and noisy. But Putin is prepared to negotiate from a position of strength, and no one in Moscow is panicking if it dies. Now compare that to Europe. Europe is in open rage, but they're too cowardly to say it plainly. They claim they welcome diplomacy while privately trying to wreck it. British media is already recycling old Russiagate-style stories right on schedule, as always, whenever U.S.-Russia talks advance. The hypocrisy is staggering. Reports say Driscoll met EU diplomats in Kyiv and the meeting became a furious row. One official called it repugnant. What did Driscoll actually say? Apparently he told them the truth. Ukraine is losing, Russia is advancing. Sanctions have devastated European economies and aren't changing the battlefield. No plan is ideal, but if you want to save what remains of Ukraine, this is the best on offer. The Europeans hated hearing it. But what exactly is repugnant here? The reality itself? Or being told reality by Washington? The same power that dragged them into this war? My guess is it's the second. Deep down, even European officials know Ukraine is losing. What enrages them is having that admitted out loud by their patron. They're now staging more meetings, the classic European reflex. Supposedly, Macron tried to reach Trump and couldn't. We're hearing a Geneva meeting is coming where Driscoll, Witkoff, and Rubio will face the Europeans. Europe's position is predictable. They don't reject peace in principle. They say they just want to adjust the plan, and by adjust they mean gut everything Russia insists on. They want NATO membership left open, no caps on Ukraine's army, no restrictions on weapon systems, more abstract language about sovereignty and borders cannot be changed by force, a principle Europe violates whenever it suits them. Yugoslavia, Sudan, Cyprus, Nagorno-Karabakh, take your pick. They just want it enforced only against Russia. They also want control over frozen Russian assets. They're furious. The U.S. might take a cut, or that assets could return to Russia because that would destroy their plan to use those funds to underwrite their own 140 billion Ukraine loan. Even the Euroclear CEO has warned them. Belgium, France, Italy have warned them. They don't care. They're obsessed with looting those assets. After Europe rewrites everything, what they'll try to resurrect is Kellogg's freeze the conflict plan, basically, Minsk III, which Russia has categorically said will never happen. So Geneva is shaping up like a showdown. But don't assume Washington is perfectly unified. Witkoff understands the battlefield. Driscoll seems to understand it. Rubio, I'm not sure he can be trusted. Starmer is pushing Trump to extend the November 27 ultimatum deadline, accept plan or lose you. My view, that ultimatum was a mistake because I doubt Trump will enforce it. The Pentagon pushed hard the last time U.S. intel was cut, and they'll push again. Trump doesn't want to be blamed for Ukraine's collapse by being the guy who pulled the plug. A better strategy would have been simple. Tell Europe, if you don't back this, I walk away. No more weapons. If you want to buy U.S. weapons and give them to Ukraine, pay cash. Otherwise, I'm done. That would have put the burden on Europe where it belongs. But Trump chose an ultimatum line, and I think he'll back off it. Trump said yesterday the deal isn't his final offer. Europeans latched onto that as if it means improvement for Kyiv. But Trump also said if Ukraine rejects this, the next deal will be worse. That's not a concession, that's a threat. It aligns with Driscoll's message. This is the best you're getting. Russia holds the cards. If you keep fighting, you'll lose, and the next terms will be harsher. Now, I've got to be honest. I don't think this diplomatic effort has strong prospects. The Senate is still rabidly pro-Ukraine. Lindsey Graham is already tweeting against the plan. And even before negotiating with Russia, this plan is barely surviving internal Western warfare. Once Moscow rewrites it, it will look even less like what Europe wants. Why is Trump still pushing diplomacy? Because 3 weeks ago, the U.S. establishment finally accepted that the Ukraine is holding narrative was a fairy tale. The front is cracking. Russia is close to breaking through Donbass. And if Donbass falls, Ukraine opens up to a Russian advance to the Dnipro, lose everything east of the Dnipro, and the Ukrainian economy is dead. If Russia crosses the Dnipro, Ukraine as a state is effectively finished. That realization triggered the sudden push for talks. But the forces opposing reality in Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv are still powerful. They literally find reality repugnant. They have also note, Geneva is another Western meeting without Russia present. Like Eve Smith said ages ago, the West is negotiating with itself, not with the other side. Moscow isn't in Geneva, so whatever happens there is just theater unless it aligns with Russian terms. Ukraine will be there, led by Umerov and Yermak, the very two officials targeted by anti-corruption investigations. Reports out of Kyiv say Umerov could be charged by NABU today. Zelensky is doubling down on them anyway. EU ambassadors are pressuring Kyiv to drop the investigations. So, yes, Zelensky still dominates his internal apparatus, but his popularity is wrecked. And that internal stability can only last weeks, not months, if the front keeps collapsing. One more important thing, there are credible Russian reports of a secret meeting among non-Western central banks, BRICS adjacent and global South states about frozen assets, European financial stability, and secondary sanctions risk. China and Russia weren't directly present, but Moscow fed input, according to these reports. Russia told them the $300 billion frozen assets number is incomplete, that the total value of Russian state property frozen in the West is far higher. Also, Russia holds Western private assets inside Russia worth more than the Western freeze figure. If Europe confiscates Russian state assets, Russia will confiscate Western assets in retaliation. Historically, seizure of state assets is an act of war. Russia knows that. So do these central banks, they were reportedly stunned. They discussed U.S. secondary sanctions. Consensus full economic war on Russia is unlikely because it would detonate the global economy and smash Western economies first. Still, they resolved that if secondary sanctions do come, they will remain calm, maintain ties with Russia, and ride it out. Russia told them if any country chooses the West over Russia, Moscow won't hold a grudge, but most signaled they won't do it. That's multipolar resilience in action. I can't independently verify that meeting, but the source is consistently reliable and the logic fits the trend line. So I'm flagging it for you. Now, the battlefield. Quickly, Russia conducted another major drone missile strike across Ukraine. I'll provide details next program. Russian advances continue in Zaporizhia. The push toward Huliaipol is nearing. The encirclement of Ukrainian forces in Myrnohrad is now complete. Russian troops pushed along the main road from northeast Pokrovsk toward Rodinsky and linked with Russian forces advancing south from Rodinsky. That creates a continuous ring around the Myrnohrad garrison. Until now, there were gaps under Russian fire control. Those gaps are now sealed. Ukrainian drone footage indirectly confirms it. They're striking Russian positions along the Pokrovsk-Mirnorod-Rudinsky road. Russians can't be there unless the circle has closed. Rudinsky is being cleared in the north. Novopavlivka is now in Russian hands, and Russia is mopping up. The Seversk situation is collapsing fast. Southern positions fell. Plotnivka and Yampil to the west are gone. The Slavyansk-Seversk road is cut. The southeastern supply route is also reportedly cut. That means Seversk is effectively in a supply cauldron. Escape is theoretically possible across fields, but in late autumn mud under drone hunting, that's a horror show. Kupiansk remains quiet in public reporting, but Russia is tightening around Ukrainian forces east of the Oskil River. Pokrovsk is on the verge of a formal fall announcement. It's a race now. Which gets declared first, Seversk or Pokrovsk? My guess, the Russian MOD will announce Seversk first. All these cauldrons, Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, Mirnohod, Seversk, Sun, Lyman, are not isolated. They're overtures to the big act, the encirclement of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. The great Donbass cauldron people talked about in early 2022 is coming into view. If it forms this winter, and if the war drags into spring, summer 2026, it's very hard to imagine anything other than the final collapse of Ukraine as a viable state. Washington can see it. Europe pretends not to. And when told, they call reality repugnant. And that's where things stand today. I have to wrap it there. Time's up and I've got to move. You can find my work on Locals, Rumble, and X. If you want to support what I do, Patreon and Subscribestar are there, and check the shop and Substack as well. The 2025 Johannesburg G20 Summit marked a profound and unmistakable turning point in the evolution of global power. For the first time in the group's history, a full joint declaration on climate, finance, and geopolitical security was adopted without the participation, approval, or even symbolic presence of the United States. This was not a procedural glitch or an accidental diplomatic oversight. It was the visible surface of a much deeper structural shift. For decades, the United States operated under the assumption that multilateral legitimacy flowed through Washington, that institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and G20 were extensions of American leadership, and that nothing of global significance could be codified unless the U.S. had shaped, edited, or endorsed it. Johannesburg proved that era is over. The world no longer pauses while Washington debates. The world no longer renegotiates when Washington objects. The world, for the first time in the post-Cold War period, simply moved on. South Africa's insistence that the declaration was non-negotiable and crafted deliberately without American involvement was not defiance for its own sake. It reflected the growing confidence of the global South, which has expanded its economic weight, diplomatic coordination, and political will. This confidence is rooted in material reality. The majority of future global economic growth will come from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These regions share structural interests, climate compensation, debt reform, technology access, fairer financial systems, and no longer accept that U.S. preferences should override their own priorities. Even when Argentina withdrew from the declaration in alignment with the Trump administration, it only served to highlight a deeper truth. Global consensus is no longer shaped around the comfort of a U.S. aligned minority. One outlier cannot block the collective will of the world's rising powers. This shift becomes even more significant when we consider the war in Ukraine and the collapse of the Western narrative surrounding it. For 3 years, Washington attempted to frame Ukraine as the moral centerpiece of global politics, rallying NATO, imposing sanctions on Russia, and demanding that the global South isolate Moscow. But most of the world refused to mortgage its economic stability to a conflict happening thousands of miles away. Johannesburg was the clearest expression yet of that refusal. Countries see the war not as a universal crusade, but as a regional conflict with global spillovers, one that requires negotiation, not indefinite escalation. And in this context, Russia's position has only strengthened. Sanctions that were meant to break Moscow instead pushed a massive restructuring of global trade, accelerating energy reorientation, payment system diversification, and South-South financial cooperation. The G20's ability to function without the U.S. is, in part, a byproduct of the world adapting to Russia's continued relevance and resilience. This is where American absence at Johannesburg becomes strategically consequential. By boycotting the summit, Washington forfeited its ability to shape the text, the tone, or the global agenda, and inadvertently ceded diplomatic ground to countries far more comfortable with a multipolar system in which Russia is not an outcast but an anchor. Leadership in the 21st century is no longer measured by military bases or dollar reserves alone. It is measured by coalition building, agenda setting, and the ability to produce collective outcomes. A leader who does not show up cannot lead. Worse, a leader who boycotts when they cannot dictate terms reveals insecurity, not strength. Meanwhile, the Global South's willingness to finalize a declaration without the United States demonstrates its rising geopolitical maturity. These nations do not see themselves as passengers in a U.S.-designed world order. They see themselves as co-authors of global norms, and in this new environment, Russia's diplomatic position benefits from its consistent engagement, its reliable energy partnerships, and its growing strategic weight in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Many states no longer view Moscow as the destabilizing actor portrayed by Western media, but as a counterbalance to U.S. unilateralism and a partner willing to engage on equal terms. Washington's reaction accusing South Africa of undermining G20 principles and threatening to restore legitimacy during its 2026 presidency only reinforced the perception that the U.S. sees multilateralism not as a shared structure, but as a hierarchy with itself at the top. Tools like visa manipulation, agenda re-engineering, procedural tightening, and economic pressure may give Washington short-term leverage, but they risk alienating powerful middle states like India, Brazil, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia. Heavy-handed retaliation could fracture the G20 into competing blocs, accelerating the very multipolarity the U.S. is desperately trying to contain. What Johannesburg truly revealed is that global governance has entered a new stage. Collective agency now outweighs hegemonic approval. The world has learned that crises, climate shocks, debt collapses, food instability, and war cannot wait for U.S. domestic politics to stabilize. And when the U.S. chooses absence, the system no longer freezes, it adapts. This is not the end of American power, but it is the end of the assumption that global progress requires American permission. Russia understands this better than anyone. By holding its ground militarily, reconfiguring its economy, and deepening ties with the global South, Moscow has positioned itself as a central pillar of the emerging order, not by dominating it, but by aligning with the world's long-term structural trends. As Washington prepares to assume the G20 presidency, it faces a stark choice: attempt to claw back control through pressure, or embrace a world where leadership must be negotiated, shared, and earned. If the U.S. tries to reimpose the old hierarchy, it will isolate itself further. If it adapts, it may retain a meaningful role in shaping the 21st century. But the summit in Johannesburg has already delivered a verdict. The world can move forward without the United States. And in many areas, especially where Russia remains influential, it already is.